Welcome to the Marvel Mindset, a podcast from ex-Marvel CEO Peter Cuneo. Listen as Peter shares inside stories of what it took to turn around Marvel. Here's your host, Peter Cuneo.
Well, welcome again to all of you. I'm Peter Cuneo. I was privileged to be the CEO of Marvel Entertainment for almost 4 years as CEO and then almost 6 years as vice chairman of the board. Marvel has been called the greatest turnaround in the 21st century. So I often get a lot of questions about the details of how we did it. How did we actually go from bankruptcy to selling to the Walt Disney Company 10 years later for $4.5 billion? How did that happen? And so I'm going to be covering a lot of area over the next 11 weeks. And I think it's going to be a lot of fun, actually, and I'm looking forward to it. There hasn't been a lot said or written about Marvel's success, except when you consider the creative areas, of course, motion pictures, comic books. But there was a lot more to the resurrection of Marvel. And without that other stuff, which I'm going to be talking about, Marvel would not have been successful. So I'm looking forward to it. We often use the phrase turnaround, and I'd like to talk about what we mean by a turnaround and also talk about, well, what really is a successful turnaround? How do you know you've been successful? I have been engaged in 7 different turnarounds. Several were in Europe, which are very different to do than in the United States because the social law is very different. If you're going to make changes in Europe, you have to negotiate with unions and negotiate with the government on your changes. So quite a bit different than what we're able to do here in the US. But my turnarounds were very interesting because in several instances, I had no background in the businesses that I was going into to try to save. That was true at Marvel. I had no experience with making motion pictures or comic books. That ended up, as I'll talk about later, ended up being a positive. In fact, in doing a turnaround, I would almost recognize that the people you bring in to lead a particular turnaround not necessarily have worked in that industry before. I think it's easier to see the problems than not if you're coming in with a completely blank sheet in front of you. I know that's controversial with some people, but that's been my experience. So the phrase turnaround is a loose term. Basically involves fixing an organization or organization that is not doing well. In fact, in my case, many of them were on the verge of extinction because things were going quite poorly. You could be in business. You could be in a public company. You could be in a private company. You could be in the military and need to make a change. You could be in education. You could be in a religious order. You could be in government and many other areas. And as a leader, have to make change. The word leadership is synonymous with change. That's what leaders do. If you're lucky, you work in a good organization, you're covering little speed bumps. Okay. But basically, it's very different when you're going to a highly challenged organization. And there's 3 areas typically that you're going to find out very quickly need immediate attention. The first is obviously financial. Okay. In extreme cases, company, organ, and business may be on the verge of going bankrupt, as Marvel did. And so the financial health of the company is very, very important. It's something that you'll look at in a turnaround immediately. Okay. The other thing that sometimes gets lost is, while the numbers are very important, you have to have a strategy that will maximize the numbers. For me, the numbers, the flow of the numbers in an organization, like the blood in your body. If your body is the organization, the blood flowing through it keeps you healthy. Same thing with the financial numbers. You'll know if you're healthy or not, depending on what's going on. So very important to, again, learn how the numbers flow what's important, what makes the numbers go up, what makes the numbers go down as quickly as you can. I would say it's very interesting because when I was at Marvel, I actually was a CEO, but I was also the CFO for 2 years, something you could never get away with today. We were a public company, but the CFO that was there when I arrived left pretty quickly to take another job. And rather than hire a new CFO, I actually took on the job of CFO as well as CEO. And I did that because I wanted to get cozy with the numbers very, very quickly. I needed to understand the numbers. And that actually worked out very well. And after 2 years of being CFO, I did hire someone else to replace me in that role. But that was a very unique situation. Again, because of Sarbanes-Oxley and other changes by the SEC and so on, I don't think you could do that anymore. But again, one of the very, very many unique things that happened at Marvel. The other thing I like to talk about on a turnaround is culture. We don't often think about culture with a business, but I always found that the culture in most of the organizations I went to was bankrupt. I'm going to define culture for you as having two different forms. The first is simply how we treat each other. Do we respect each other? Do we treat each other well? How do we treat people outside our organization, but are important to us? In business, it could be a supplier. It could be a customer. You wouldn't believe it when I told you I went into organizations where the customer was not respected. The organization thought they could sell anything to the customer. The customer wasn't very bright. There are many other cultural issues that I ran into with these turnarounds, but that's one very good example that actually popped up a couple of times. Culture, very important. How we treat each other. The other side of culture is, okay, what do we in the organization have to do really well? Really well. We have to get an A plus in to survive and to prosper. What are those things? Again, you'd be really surprised in an organization where new products every year were super important. Well, the organization didn't have anybody that was very competent working in new products. How could that be? It's one of your most important areas. So another one would be, say, customer service. We have to be great servicing the customer. The customer is a retailer and running ads. And, we need to have the product available and in their stores when they run these ads. We can't be late. We can't find out when we check the inventory we don't have enough product, even though we committed to an ad. It's those kinds of things. And those are situations that I ran into, not necessarily at Marvel, but in a lot of my turnarounds. So sweeping changes, if you're going to continue to exist, financial, strategic, and cultural. Don't go anywhere. More in just a moment. As I've said before, I really think that the science and the art of leadership, the science and the art of change is very, very important. There is science, of course. You can read your numbers. There are things that are clearly tangible, but then there are the intangibles, which often in a big turnaround are just as important, maybe more important. And actually the science, it's the art. It's dealing with people and leading. And in the case of where I was, most of these turnarounds required what I'll call radical surgery. And so science and art really mattered both. Very important if you're going into a turnaround to recognize that. Science is important, yes, but the art of change, how you make change, and I'm going to be talking more about this when we get later in this series of broadcasts, talk about the art of making change. And finally, on what is a turnaround, I think it's important for me to mention simply, what did I find at Marvel? What were Marvel's problems when I walked through the door in the summer of 1999? And again, 10 years later, we sold to Disney for $4.5 billion. But in the summer of 1999, what was I faced with? Well, first, it's very important to note, if you haven't been through a bankruptcy, and by the way, I don't wish it on anybody who's watching me right now or listening, bankruptcy is a terrible process. And it's like going through chemotherapy. And in a sense, it's the same. You, in many ways, get weaker in bankruptcy. The best people in the company may leave the company because they're worried about, or leave your organization because they're worried about the future. There may be no future for them. And they're very good at what they do, so they can leave. They can get actually a better job, or certainly a job equal to what they were doing at the organization previously. One of the downsides of bankruptcy is talent leaves. And there was a talent drain at Marvel, as you might imagine, particularly in the comic book area. And there's some legendary writers, illustrators, cover illustrators that left the company because it just felt there wasn't a future. And in some cases actually felt that they'd been mistreated during the bankruptcy or even before the bankruptcy in the past, and really wanted to have nothing to do with Marvel again. I'll get later into what we did to overcome that problem. You're, of course, weak financially as well. Most people think when they hear you're coming out of bankruptcy that you're fixed financially, okay? The reality is you're not fixed. You got enough money to continue to operate for a while to see if you're going to survive. But in many cases, people that come out of bankruptcy go back into bankruptcy a couple of years later and, of course, dissolve the organization. Because the financial structure of the company coming out of bankruptcy is only what the creditors would agree to. And the creditors don't want to lose their money. So there's an imbalance. What's right for the company, what it needs going forward, and what's right for the creditors is weighed naturally towards the creditors. So that has to be fixed. And we did some very creative things in that regard, also at Marvel, which I will get into. The talent drain, financial weakness, but also cultures, the culture of Marvel, the values that the company embraced. Very important. What was important for us to be good at, really good at, and what wasn't. And I'll be talking, of course, about those things also in future episodes. Well, that's it for today. Hope you've learned something about a turnaround and whether you want to be involved. And I was very happy to be here. And next Monday, we're going to be talking about what defines a successful turnaround. We've talked about what a turnaround means. Well, how can you say, I did a successful turnaround? When can you start to really feel good about yourself if you've been involved in that challenge? Until next Monday, Peter Cuneo saying, thanks very much